He is one of the few leaders in history whose decisions did not merely change policy, but permanently altered the moral chemistry of a nation. He did not begin as Abraham Lincoln, the martyr cast in stone. He began as a hollowed-out frontier child, starving, self-taught, and haunted by a trail of debt and early death. Before he was the savior of the Union, he was a clumsy, broken-hearted lawyer whom his own peers mocked as a well-meaning baboon. To his contemporaries, he was a walking failure, an uneducated frontiersman, hopelessly unequal to the coming fire. In this week's biography, we trace the ascension, the internal torture, and the blood-soaked legacy of the man who held a dying nation together by the sheer force of his will. The unlikely survivor, the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. In 1901, inside the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, the body of Abraham Lincoln was hoisted from the earth for the final time. Over 36 years, his rest had been plagued by grave robbers and hidden beneath secret timbers. Now he would be encased in 64 square feet of solid cement. Before the lid was sealed, 23 witnesses peered inside the lead-lined coffin to verify the remains. There were the chin whiskers, the cheek mole, and the prominent forehead of the man who had come to be regarded as America's secular saint. But before Lincoln was a monument, he was a man defined by the short and simple annals of the poor. Abraham Lincoln entered the world on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky. The structure was simple and functional, with a dirt floor underfoot and a fireplace constructed from clay and sticks. This was not a symbolic setting or a romanticized origin story. It was a working frontier shelter, typical of the time and place, designed for survival rather than comfort. The physical environment of Lincoln's birth reflected the conditions that shaped his earliest years, isolated, demanding, and defined by physical labor. His father, Thomas Lincoln, is consistently described in the historical record as a stern and illiterate farmer. He worked the land with his hands and relied on experience rather than formal education. His mother, Nancy Lincoln, is remembered very differently in recollections preserved by those who knew her. She was described as a woman of gentle character, and she was noted for her intelligence. These descriptions do not romanticize her role, but they establish a contrast within the household, a life governed by physical necessity alongside a presence associated with quiet thoughtfulness. The world Lincoln grew up in was the American frontier. Contemporary descriptions of frontier life referred to it as a constant fight with trees, logs, and grubs. This phrase was not metaphorical. Clearing land required daily physical exertion, and survival depended on transforming wilderness into workable ground. Childhood in this environment meant that labor was not optional, and daily routines were shaped by necessity rather than preference. This was the setting in which Lincoln's early habits and observations were formed. Loss came early. When Abraham Lincoln was 9 years old, his mother died from what was known at the time as milk sickness. The illness was sudden and poorly understood on the frontier, and it claimed many lives before its causes were identified decades later. For a child, the death of a parent was not only an emotional rupture, but also a practical one, altering the structure and stability of daily life. Nancy Lincoln's death marked a clear dividing line in Abraham Lincoln's childhood. Not long after, Thomas Lincoln remarried. His new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, entered the household and assumed a central role in the family. In later years, Lincoln would refer to her as his angel mother. This phrase appears repeatedly in recollections and reflects how she was remembered rather than how she was mythologized. She was credited with encouraging Lincoln's intellectual curiosity at a time when such curiosity was not universally valued. Those who recalled her relationship with Abraham later described a sense of intellectual sympathy, noting that his mind seemed to run together with hers. Formal education was minimal. Across his entire childhood, Lincoln received less than 1 year of organized schooling. There were no sustained classroom environments, no extended instruction under trained teachers. What education he acquired formally came in fragments, interrupted by labor and circumstance. This absence of schooling is not inferred, it is consistently stated in the historical record and confirmed by Lincoln himself in later accounts. In place of structured education, Lincoln turned inward and toward books. By firelight, after the demands of the day had ended, he read what was available to him. The texts most frequently cited are the Bible, the plays of Shakespeare, and Aesop's fables. These were not casual readings. They were returned to repeatedly, read and reread in the absence of alternatives. The act of reading itself required effort, physical access to books, time carved out from labor, and persistence under conditions not designed for study.
This pattern of self-education did not occur in isolation from the frontier environment, but alongside it. The same setting described as a constant struggle for survival also produced long, quiet evenings where reading by firelight was possible. Lincoln's intellectual development, as far as the evidence allows it to be traced, emerged within these constraints rather than apart from them. One episode from Lincoln's youth has been repeatedly cited as formative and is often placed when he was about 19 years old. During this period, Lincoln participated in a flatboat trip to New Orleans. Such trips were a common part of frontier commerce, transporting goods downriver to larger markets in the Deep South. New Orleans, at the time, was a major commercial center and a hub of the domestic slave trade. There, Lincoln encountered slave markets where human beings were bought and sold. Later accounts describe him witnessing enslaved people treated explicitly as commodities. Among these recollections, one image appears repeatedly: a family being separated at auction. These accounts were recorded years afterward and reflect how the moment was remembered rather than documented in real time. Nevertheless, they are consistent in their description of what he saw and how it affected him. According to these later recollections, Lincoln is said to have remarked, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." The statement is preserved as reported speech, attributed retrospectively, and presented as evidence of a reaction rather than a developed program or ideology. The historical record does not place this remark in a contemporaneous document, but it does show how the episode was later understood and recalled. This encounter is often cited as planting a lasting hostility toward slavery. The wording is important. It does not suggest immediate action, nor does it claim a fully formed position. It indicates an impression made by direct observation, an experience that remained part of Lincoln's remembered past. The New Orleans trip stands in contrast to the isolation of his earlier years, exposing him to a system that was geographically distant from the frontier, but economically and politically connected to it. By the end of this period of Lincoln's life, the essential elements are already present in the record: a birth in a frontier cabin, parents of sharply different educational backgrounds, early loss, a stepmother who encouraged learning, limited formal schooling, sustained self-education, and an early exposure to slavery through direct observation. None of these elements function alone. Together, they form the documented foundation of Lincoln's early life, not as a legend, but as a sequence of verifiable circumstances that preceded everything that came after.
By the age of 22, Abraham Lincoln arrived in New Salem, Illinois. He came without money and without formal credentials, a drifter by circumstance rather than design, carrying an ambition that at the time drew little notice from those around him. New Salem was a small frontier settlement, and in such a place reputations were built slowly, through daily conduct rather than declarations of purpose. Lincoln's early standing there did not rest on title or position, but on repeated, observable behavior. He first gained recognition as a store clerk. In this role, he developed a reputation for fairness that would later become central to how he was remembered. Accounts from the period recall him walking long distances to return small sums, pennies, to customers who had been overcharged. These stories circulated locally and were repeated often enough that they helped fix the nickname Honest Abe. Whether recounted as anecdote or recollection, they functioned as evidence of how Lincoln was perceived within his community, attentive to fairness in minor transactions and unwilling to dismiss small obligations. Lincoln also established local standing through the physical and social tests common to frontier life. One of the most frequently cited episodes from this period is a wrestling match with Jack Armstrong, a local gang leader. The contest was widely remembered not because of its athletic significance alone, but because of its outcome. What began as a rivalry ended as an alliance. The incident reinforced Lincoln's acceptance within the community and demonstrated his ability to navigate confrontation without prolonged hostility. Despite these gains in reputation, Lincoln's economic footing remained unstable. A store partnership failed, leaving him with a debt of $1,800. Lincoln himself later referred to this obligation with dry humor as his national debt. The phrase did not obscure the reality of the burden. For a young man of limited means, such a sum represented years of responsibility rather than a temporary setback. This financial failure did not end his ambitions, but it redirected them. In the aftermath of this failure, Lincoln turned toward the law. He did so without formal legal education. His training was largely self-directed. He studied logic through Euclid's Elements and worked on language through Kirkham's English grammar. These texts are consistently cited in accounts of his preparation, not as symbols, but as practical tools he used to build competence. His legal education unfolded outside institutions, shaped by reading, repetition, and application rather than instruction. As a practicing attorney, Lincoln rode the 8th Judicial Circuit. This work required travel across multiple counties, appearing in different communities, and addressing juries drawn from rural populations. Over time, he developed a reputation as a persuasive advocate. His method was notable for its simplicity. He spoke to juries in plain language, avoiding technical display. Rather than presenting himself as an elite professional, he positioned himself as a neighbor, someone who explained rather than impressed. This approach became a defining feature of his legal persona. In 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd. She was a well-educated woman from a prosperous Kentucky family that owned enslaved people. Mary believed strongly in Lincoln's future prominence. Accounts from those who knew them suggest that her confidence in his prospects sometimes exceeded his own. Her expectations were clear, and she articulated them openly within their relationship. Their marriage, however, was marked by strain. Contemporary observers remarked frequently on Lincoln's recurring melancholy. These episodes were not described casually. They were noted with enough seriousness that at one point, friends took precautions for his safety.
Such remarks appear in recollections rather than clinical descriptions, but they recur across sources, indicating that his condition was visible to those around him and considered significant. By the end of this period, Lincoln had established himself as a recognizable figure on the Illinois frontier, known for fairness in small matters, tested in social and physical encounters, burdened by debt yet persistent, self-taught in the law, and shaped by a marriage that combined belief in his future with personal strain. These elements, taken together, define the phase of his life in which ambition began to take structured form, grounded not in sudden transformation, but in accumulated experience and sustained effort.
Abraham Lincoln's return to national political life followed the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The legislation reopened a question that many Americans believed had been temporarily settled: whether slavery would be permitted to expand into new U.S. territories. For Lincoln, this moment marked the end of what he later described as a period of political wilderness. During those intervening years, he had remained engaged with public affairs, but largely absent from the national stage. The act altered that condition by reintroducing slavery as a central, unavoidable political issue. In response, Lincoln aligned himself with the newly formed Republican Party. This affiliation did not emerge in isolation, but within a broader realignment of American politics triggered by the act itself. The reopening of the slavery question reshaped existing coalitions and created space for new political identities. Lincoln's re-entry into politics occurred within this shifting environment, where old party loyalties were breaking down and new ones were being assembled. 4 years later, in 1858, Lincoln challenged Senator Stephen Douglas for a seat in the United States Senate. Douglas was already a nationally recognized figure, widely known by the nickname the Little Giant. The contest between them unfolded publicly through a series of 7 debates held across Illinois. These debates were widely reported at the time, drawing attention well beyond the immediate electoral stakes of a single Senate seat. Throughout the debates, Lincoln advanced a central argument that a nation divided over the question of slavery could not endure indefinitely. He framed this position by invoking a biblical warning, stating that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The phrase was not introduced as a rhetorical flourish detached from context, but as a direct expression of his position on the long-term viability of a political system split over slavery's future. His argument did not predict immediate collapse, but it asserted that permanent division was unsustainable. Despite the visibility of the debates, Lincoln did not win the election. The Illinois legislature ultimately selected Douglas for the Senate seat. In conventional terms, the campaign ended in defeat. However, the consequences extended beyond the immediate outcome. By the late 1850s, newspapers and the telegraph had significantly expanded the reach of political discourse. Reports of the debates circulated far beyond Illinois, carrying Lincoln's arguments to a national audience that had not previously encountered him in such a sustained way. As a result, the figure long described as a prairie lawyer was recast in the public imagination. His words, reproduced and debated across state lines, transformed him from a regional politician into a national presence. This shift did not occur through office holding, but through exposure. The debates functioned as a vehicle for dissemination, allowing his views on slavery and national unity to enter broader political discussion.
2 years later, Lincoln campaigned for the presidency on a platform that opposed the extension of slavery into the territories. In the election that followed, he was chosen as the 16th President of the United States. His victory came without carrying a single Southern electoral vote. The result underscored the depth of sectional division that already existed at the moment of his election. By the time Lincoln assumed office, the issues raised in the debates with Douglas had moved from theoretical argument to the center of national power. This period, from the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to Lincoln's election, traces a clear progression. It begins with re-entry from political obscurity, moves through public argument and electoral defeat, and ends with national elevation. Each step is documented, sequential, and connected by the expanding visibility of ideas rather than by sudden reversal of fortune.
Abraham Lincoln entered the presidency at a moment when the Union was already beginning to fracture. Secession had moved from debate to action, and the authority of the federal government was openly contested. Just 5 weeks after Lincoln took office, Confederate artillery fired on Fort Sumter. The attack marked the formal opening of armed conflict and eliminated any remaining uncertainty about whether compromise alone could contain the crisis. From that point forward, Lincoln was confronted not with abstract political disagreement, but with active rebellion. In response, Lincoln took a series of measures that pushed executive authority to its outer limits. Among these actions was the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. This decision allowed for detention without immediate judicial review, a step taken under the pressure of wartime conditions. In doing so, Lincoln acted in defiance of a ruling issued by Chief Justice Roger Taney, who challenged the legality of the suspension. Lincoln also authorized military arrests of individuals suspected of Confederate sympathy. These actions were controversial at the time and remained so afterward, but they reflected the reality of governing amid internal conflict rather than theoretical debate. The early years of the war offered little reassurance that these measures would lead to quick resolution. Union armies experienced repeated setbacks on the battlefield. Campaigns failed to produce decisive victories, and public confidence wavered. In response, Lincoln replaced one commanding general after another, including George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and others. These changes were not symbolic gestures. They reflected a continuing search for leadership capable of translating Union resources into effective military results. Each replacement underscored the uncertainty that characterized the war's opening phase. Throughout this period, Lincoln remained closely involved with military affairs. He spent long nights in the War Department reviewing telegraph dispatches as they arrived from the front. Maps were studied in detail, movements traced and retraced as reports came in. This routine was not occasional but sustained, reflecting the demands of a conflict that unfolded across vast distances and required constant attention. The presidency during wartime became, in practice, an extended vigil. As casualties mounted, the costs of the war became increasingly visible to the public. Lists of the dead and wounded circulated widely, and the scale of loss grew harder to absorb. Amid this public suffering, private grief entered the White House itself. Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever. The death occurred while the war was ongoing and added a personal loss to the already heavy burdens of office. It did not interrupt the conflict, but it became part of the human context in which decisions continued to be made. By late 1862, Lincoln reached a conclusion that marked a turning point in the conduct of the war.
He determined that preserving the Union and confronting slavery could no longer be treated as separate objectives. The two issues, once argued as distinct, had become inseparable in practice. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document was framed explicitly as a military necessity grounded in the president's war powers rather than in peacetime legislation. Despite this framing, the proclamation altered the meaning of the conflict. It redefined the war's purpose in the eyes of many, both within the United States and beyond it. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union was now openly linked to the fate of human bondage. This shift did not end the war, nor did it resolve its immediate challenges, but it changed the terms under which the conflict was understood. Taken together, this period represents the most sustained test of Lincoln's leadership. It combined constitutional strain, military uncertainty, public loss, and private grief, all unfolding under the pressure of an ongoing rebellion. The decisions made during these years were shaped by circumstance rather than abstraction, and they set the framework for how the war would continue to be fought and remembered.
By 1863, the course of the war began to shift in ways that were widely recognized at the time. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a turning point in the conflict. These successes did not bring the war to an immediate close, but they altered its trajectory. For the first time, sustained Union advances suggested that the outcome was no longer entirely uncertain. The significance of these victories was understood not only in military terms, but also in how they reshaped public perception of the war's direction. Later that same year, Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania for the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg. The event itself was formal and ceremonial, intended to honor the dead. Lincoln's contribution to the occasion was brief. His address consisted of 272 words. In length, it was modest. In its framing of national purpose, it proved enduring. In the speech, he described the nation as one conceived in liberty, grounding the meaning of the war in the country's founding principles. The address did not recount the battle in detail, nor did it announce new policy. Instead, it offered a concise statement of what the conflict had come to represent. Around this period, Lincoln placed his confidence in Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had distinguished himself through a willingness to accept the realities of sustained attritional warfare. His approach differed from that of earlier commanders whom Lincoln had replaced. Rather than seeking a single decisive maneuver, Grant pressed continuously, absorbing losses while inflicting them. Lincoln's decision to support Grant reflected a judgment about how the war would have to be fought if it were to be brought to an end. As the war continued into 1864, its cumulative toll became increasingly visible in Lincoln himself. Contemporary observers remarked on his physical appearance. He appeared thinner, with noticeable weight loss. His eyes were described as sunken, and his overall demeanor as increasingly haggard. These descriptions came from those who saw him regularly and reflected the visible strain of prolonged leadership under wartime conditions. The presidency, already demanding in peacetime, had become an unrelenting burden. Despite this visible wear, Lincoln secured re-election in 1864. The victory affirmed public support for continuing the war under his leadership rather than seeking a negotiated settlement. Following the election, Lincoln turned his attention to ensuring that the end of slavery would be anchored in constitutional law. He pressed Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. Unlike wartime proclamations grounded in executive authority, the amendment would permanently abolish slavery through the Constitution itself. Its passage represented a decisive legal step distinct from military necessity. The final months of the war unfolded rapidly.
On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox. The surrender effectively ended major Confederate resistance. For many Americans, it signaled the conclusion of 4 years of sustained conflict, though formal peace would take time to establish. 5 days later, on Good Friday, Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater. The outing was public and unremarkable, consistent with his habit of remaining accessible even during wartime. During the performance, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box. Booth was a well-known actor who understood the symbolism of the act he intended to carry out. He cast himself in the role of a modern Brutus, framing his action through classical reference rather than political program. He fired a single shot. Lincoln was mortally wounded. He did not regain consciousness. The following morning, at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln died. His death came just days after the effective end of the war he had led through its most destructive years. By the close of this final act, Lincoln's public life had moved from battlefield victory to national mourning with little transition. The war ended with the Union preserved and slavery constitutionally abolished, but its conclusion was immediately overshadowed by assassination. The sequence of events, military success, constitutional change, surrender, and death, defined how Lincoln's presidency ended and how it would be remembered, not as a completed project, but as one cut short at the moment of resolution.
After Abraham Lincoln's death, his body was carried home on a funeral train that traveled approximately 1,700 miles. The journey passed through multiple cities and towns, retracing in reverse the path that had brought him to the presidency years earlier. Along the length of the route, millions of people gathered near the tracks. Contemporary accounts describe crowds standing in silence, watching as the train passed. The scale of public attendance was unprecedented, reflecting the breadth of the nation touched by his death. This return journey underscored the contrast between Lincoln's arrival in Washington and his departure from it. When he first entered the Capitol, he was widely regarded as an obscure figure on the national stage. Political opponents dismissed him as an uneducated frontiersman, a label that emphasized his lack of formal schooling and his origins on the western frontier. These characterizations circulated openly during his rise to office and formed part of the resistance he faced as president. By the time of his death, that public image had been fundamentally altered. Lincoln left Washington not as a contested political leader, but as a martyr. His assassination transformed how many Americans understood his presidency and his role in the nation's history. In death, he became closely identified with two outcomes that defined the Civil War's conclusion: the preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery for millions who had been held in bondage. These associations did not arise from a single moment, but from the sequence of events that had culminated in the war's end and his own killing. At Lincoln's bedside, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was reported to have spoken words that would be repeated for generations. "Now he belongs to the ages." The statement was brief and retrospective, framing Lincoln's death as a transition from political life into historical memory. It did not enumerate accomplishments or policies. Instead, it marked a moment of closure, signaling that Lincoln's place was no longer in ongoing debate, but in the longer view of history. In the years that followed, Lincoln's memory and commemoration continued to evolve.
Through mourning rituals, public remembrance, and repeated quotation of his words, he came to embody a particular national proposition. He was associated with the idea that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people might yet endure. This phrase, drawn from his own wartime language, became a shorthand for how his leadership was understood after his death. The epilogue of Lincoln's life, as recorded in these events, does not add new actions or decisions. It records how his presidency concluded and how it was received. The funeral train, the silent crowds, the shift from ridicule to reverence, and the words spoken at his bedside together form the final chapter. They show how a man who entered office under suspicion and division came, through death, to be situated within the nation's enduring historical narrative.